Hey, Claudia.
Hey!
Hey, how are you? Oh,
You're in
I
okay.
should change my backdrop.
Oh, nice. You even have it reserved.
I have the official one. Shoot, I was going to change it because I have other official ones. Let me see if I can find one.
You can also keep it. That's pretty
Sorry.
cool. No problem.
I was using it for this VRE webinar yesterday and I forgot to
Yeah,
change it.
I see.
Hello.
Hey!
Oh.
Oh, we are all called Rita now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the people can listen. Okay. That's good.
Hey, Jessica.
Hello.
Hello to everyone. Oh, yeah, I see the number of participants is increasing.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Hi, Pete.
Hey, Peter.
Fantastic to
Hey.
have you here.
Good afternoon, Tina. Hello, everybody.
Hello, everyone. Let's wait. Let's wait. We have still quite a lot of registrants that haven't logged in. So let's wait a couple of minutes. Yeah, okay. I can start. I will try to now share some slides. Let's see first the screen and then the slides. Here we go. Okay, is that okay? Okay, maybe we'll start now. So welcome to this FAIRSFAIR webinar. I'm Jessica Parlon von Essen from CSC, and I will be acting as a moderator here. So we will have our presentations first, and then we can take questions. Maybe preferably if you can write the questions in the chat, we will try to answer the questions then after the presentations. But first, I just want to make a short introduction about the background or context of this webinar. So for those who maybe aren't so familiar with what we are doing. So some words about the FAIRSFAIR project. The FAIRSFAIR project aims at enabling and promoting an interoperable European Open Science Cloud. This is a 3-year project that's running to the beginning of 2022. yes, here you can see one version of our objective. We want to create a basis for harmonization efforts to bring together the various actors to create a fair ecosystem and build a functioning EOSC and an active community. And we have 7 work packages, besides the one on project management and the one on dissemination and communications. There are work packages on fair practices, semantics, technical interoperability and services, one on data policy and practice, one on certification of repositories, then on fair competencies, and the 7th work packages on fair data science curricula and professionalization. And yes, please, if you aren't familiar with this project, one good place to start is of course the FAIRSFAIR.eu webpage, where you can find a lot of information about our activities and what we are doing. And also I would like to mention we have on Zenodo a FAIRSFAIR community where you can find our project outputs. So this webinar, specific webinar, is organized by work package 2. It's titled Fair Practices, Semantics, Interoperability and Services. And we're in this work package looking at how we can enable the FAIR ecosystem in a more technical way, or we have a more technical approach looking at technologies. We're looking at what it really requires to enable fair data, and since the fair data principles are written for fair data, but we need the whole ecosystem to enable that. So we need to also think what the implications are for services and repositories to enable this fair development. We mentioned some outputs already that we have produced. Firstly, there is the report on fair requirements for persistence and interoperability, which is a quite long, it's 20 pages report with a landscape looking at the S3 infrastructure from a fair perspective. And then there's also some text about persistent identifiers and semantic interoperability. So that one might be interesting for some people. Then also quite recently we published the FAIR Semantics first recommendations, which is a set of recommendations or suggested recommendations for semantic artifacts that, well, something an umbrella term for ontologies and vocabularies, control vocabularies and terminologies, and different kinds of means or tools we have to use to create semantic machine readable interoperability, and how these as data object also can be fair. And this work is closely linked to the RDA Vocabulary Services Interest Group. And so there's very interesting discussions are ongoing there. So please, if you're interested, jump on to those. And we're having workshops also in FAIRSFAIR on that theme. Then our neighboring work packages, work package 3, Fair Data Policy and Practice, which is working with policy and practice, as it says, more on the policy level. There are some landscape reports also that can be found both via the webpage and the Zenodo community. And also especially important for us is work package 4, where this work package is working with certification, assessing and evaluation of fair repositories and data sets. So they are working with repositories for Cortra Steel certification. And the idea is, of course, here that you can't have a fair data object without a data repository. There is a really crucial and important interdependence there. So here are some of their outputs, first recommendations for or requirements for FAIR datasets in certified repositories. Also, they have produced several extra papers and materials and outputs that are really interesting, which you can find on Zenodo. So in short, the EOSC landscape is vast and huge and complex, and there is a lot of interesting things that are going on. And FAIRSFAIR is working with trying to facilitate cooperation and communication between all the EOSC work packages and all the other projects within EOSC and also other FAIR projects. So this is just a very brief overview of the project, and I hope and welcome you to this webinar, and enjoy the webinar, and I hope we can have a good discussion. We really invite and encourage people to participate and give comments, because it's really important for us to get community engagement and feedback on everything we do. So now I think I will leave the floor to, is it Claudia, who will continue?
I think I'll go next, according to our running order. Yeah?
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Okay.
Jessica, you can perhaps mute yourself. I'm hearing there's a little bit of noise in the background. All right, let me share my screen for the second contribution after Jessica's introduction. Here we go. All right, I can't see the chat now, so I'm assuming people can see my screen. If not, then I ask one of the panelists to shout. So, thank you all for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's a pleasure to have so many of you joining us today, so thanks a lot. I'll talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing in FAIRSFAIR Task 2.4 around FAIR for services and software. So my name is Hielke Koers. I'm a group leader data management at SURF, a colleague of Claudia, who will speak afterwards, and part of work package 2, which is according to the diagram that was already shown just now, part of work package 2 around FAIR practices, semantics, interoperability, and services. So that's the bit of FAIRSFAIR where you are at. And our task really centered around the question, what does it take for a service to be fair? But actually, we started with another question to be able to answer this one, is, well, namely, is that even the right question to ask? So we really wanted to go take a few steps back and work through what is really a sensible way of thinking around how to apply the concept of FAIR to the notion of a service. And I wanted to guide you through that thinking process and then elaborate a little bit on where we ended, where we landed on so far in our journey to answer that question, and share some of the preliminary findings. And really to sort of guide you through the thinking, I really again want to take a few steps back and really start at, well, the bare notion of data, the bit sequence, bits and bytes that somehow represent useful information. And of course, as we all know, we are not satisfied with just data. We want to have fair data, which means we want to associate metadata to the digital object. We want to associate a persistent identifier, and of course, a couple of other qualities and attributes. And we want to do some things with the data to really make them findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. For example, put them in a trustworthy data repository. Abstracting a little bit from that notion, you easily get to what is known as a fair digital object, which is a combination of the bitstream, metadata, and persistent identifiers, the holy trinity of research data, of course, underpinned by domain-specific standards that make sure that you, as the creator of the data, are not the only one who can find and access the data, but your colleagues can do that as well. And of course, this concept of a fair digital object is not only applied to data sets, but also to research software, methods, ontologies, basically a whole variety of valuable scholarly output. These fair digital objects, you can really think of them as inhabitants in an ecosystem, happily coexisting, different flavors, different colors, different tastes, all living happily together, and also living at various stages in the research data lifecycle. So this notion really spans across the life cycle or the journey of research data. So there's data that has just been created, and for the sake of this presentation, I'll assume that it has been verified already at its creation. For example, imagine this coming out of a machine that already adds persistent identifiers and metadata to it. It can be data that's still being analyzed, data that's already been published in a data repository, and of course, at the end of the day, data that's being reused, which of course is one of the primary drivers for this whole concept. Zooming in a little bit more detail on those various aspects, all the way in the beginning, data is created and analyzed, of course. Then data being put into a data repository if it's being published. And of course, data eventually being discovered with the purpose of reuse so that it can prove its value once again. And really the point of this slide is for all of these phases, this does not happen by itself. It does not happen automatically. You need tools, you need services to really act on the data and add value to it and bring it forward to the next phase of the data lifecycle. Underpinning all of this are horizontal supporting foundational services, if you like. For example, services that mint PIDs or that resolve PIDs. Services that take care of the linking between fair digital object registries, and there's a whole lot of more. So to really make this work and to enable and support these fair digital objects throughout the life cycle is really not only about the content, it's also very much about the tools and the services that act on them. Or in other words, if the fair digital object is the notes to the music, then I would argue that services are the rhythm and the cadence. And as we all know, you need both to really have a nice symphony. Or perhaps a bit more prosaically, there's straws and there's berries, and you need both to get strawberries. Or another word, I think, maybe sort of the tagline of my part of the presentation, you need the objects and the services as a perfect pair for a fair data ecosystem. Now, I'm mindful that this was fairly hand-waving, right? I spoke about ecosystem without really defining what it means a couple of times. I won't do that in this presentation, this webinar, because you can easily spend an entire webinar on that. Also, there's a couple of people in the audience who are much more knowledgeable about this one. So I just wanted to give this references. This is really elaborated and made a lot more precise in the Turning Fair into Reality report, which was published in 2018. I think many of you will be familiar with the work. If you're not, I would really recommend it. It's really a great piece and very worth the effort to study it. And also this notion of a fair data ecosystem is made much more precise in there. So then, if this is indeed the case, if this notion of a fair data ecosystem exists, if we know what the role of the data objects is and the data services, then what's the issue? Why do we need a task? For me, the answer to that question is that, as we all know, FAIR is not an absolute. It's not a 1 and a 0. The FAIR principles were always meant as guiding principles, and they need further interpretation and definition by the research community to really become actionable. For fair data in itself, a lot of work has been already done on that, leading to all kinds of checklists and assessment, certification schemes, etc. But for services, that's not really the case, and much less work has gone into elaborating on that question so far. And so at this point in time, there is little guidance, limited guidance for service owners, people who run data services, on what should they do, what are the recommendations, the guidelines, the tools to make their service really optimally fit in that fair data ecosystem. And that's exactly what the core objective of this task 2.4 around fair services, what it's all about. What we have set as an objective for ourselves is to deliver an assessment framework for data service that will enable and stimulate such an interplay between the data objects and services, and in doing that, help realize the full potential of a truly fair ecosystem. I should point out that the task is also around FAIR for software. That's equally important. I only mentioned here it between parentheses because the scope of this particular webinar is around FAIR services, but the task is also really pertaining to FAIR software. We kicked this off in earnest in August, so we're sort of 8-9 months in right now. What we have done so far is basically, elaborating and thinking through and challenging our thinking on how we want to structure the work and what we want to deliver. We have done a review of existing FAIR assessment frameworks for data sets, and also looked then basically what's already been done, what's the existing body of knowledge on the thinking around assessment frameworks for services. Then, to make it more tangible and practical, we've done a couple of case studies where we took existing services from the EOS catalog and in a pretty much ad hoc manner try to make sense of the question, how is this service enabling FAIR? And then we formulated a couple of guiding principles, not yet for the services themselves, but really how do we think this assessment framework should look like? What kind of requirements or desiderata do we have for the assessment framework in itself? So still at a higher level than the individual services, if you like. And of course, throughout, we had a lot of interactions and discussions with our stakeholders and related working groups and projects. Because of course, this is part of a much broader effort, lots of people looking on how to turn FAIR into practice, into reality, how to operationalize all of this. So in the remaining bit of my presentation, I just wanted to take you through some of the work that we've done, share what we have done so far in these 4 bullet points. And really hoping at the end of the presentation, when Claudia also contributed her work on the data repository side, solicit your feedback and really challenge us to make sure that we are doing the right thing. So in terms of the review of FAIR assessment frameworks for data, we did quite an extensive literature review. There are still way more, but we analyzed 4 existing FAIR assessment frameworks for data that we already found. We did a fairly high-level analysis, so not yet looking into the nitty-gritty details of them, but really what is the audience for the assessment framework? What is the purpose, if there is a stated purpose? Is there a particular target audience? Could be a particular domain or service providers or other roles, if you like. And what are the elements? So that gave us a good handle on the current landscape of review assessment, FAIR assessment frameworks for data. We also looked on what's on the market, if you like, around assessment frameworks for services. And we found that they sort of quite naturally fall into 3 categories. There's the assessment frameworks and certification schemes really looking at data repositories. And a lot of this activity has been focused on data repositories for good reasons. And so Claudia will elaborate a little bit on that, for example, Core Trust 2. There's another group of assessment frameworks that are, I think, essentially around rules of engagement or rules of participation. What are the criteria that as a service you must meet in order to join this club? And the club could be the European Open Science Cloud or, for example, frameworks like Elixir. And then thirdly, there are more general service quality requirements stemming from IT service management, for example, FitSM, which was also developed in an EOS context. And there's some preliminary work done by people from EGI, Owen Appleton, around SMART guidelines for services, which really come from a background of service quality. There's more detail in this in the report, of course, but these are sort of the 3 broad categories that we identified. But we feel that there's still very much a gap specifically on this FAIR enablement, on this FAIR alignment of service. So, as a service owner, what should I do to gradually improve my service to optimally fit in this FAIR data ecosystem? We also did a couple of case studies. I'm just highlighting one, B2Find, where we looked at the existing service proposition and then we mapped that against the FAIR principles. And for each of the FAIR principles, we try to map the service to one of 4. Is this service really enabling this particular FAIR principle? Is it actively making this FAIR principle, or is it helping the data that it acts on to meet this FAIR principle? Is it respecting the FAIR principle in the sense that if the data set, the FAIR digital object, if that already meets that principle, and now the service acts on it, it still respects, it still has that principle. So it basically preserves the level of fairness, or fair in, fair out, if you like. It could also be that the service actually reduces the level of fairness of an object that it acts upon. And in some cases, this is just orthogonal. The service has nothing to do with this particular attribute of fair. So really, to give two illustrations of that, and there's well, the full mapping, you can find that in the report that we have published so far. But just to illustrate some of the things that we find, for example, and here again taking B to find as an example, looking at FAIR principle 1, the first of the findability ones, where metadata are assigned a globally unique and eternally persistent identifier. In the case of B2Find, our analysis is that it respects this FAIR principle, which is to say that if the metadata contains the PID, then it will still be there after B2Find has operated on the object. In case of F2, data are described with rich metadata, it really enables that property. I'm sure that the actual details of this statement can be discussed, and that's perfectly fine. That is exactly what we wanted to initiate with this kind of a case study. So this is by no means meant to be normative around the services themselves. We really did this analysis and presented the results to show the methodology and get feedback on, is this a good way to do this kind of mapping, of figuring out, is this service really enabling, respecting, or in some case, reducing the level of fairness of the digital objects that it operates on. The last bit that I wanted to share about our results so far, we have basically put forward some draft guidelines for this FAIR assessment framework. So the task will be working to deliver this type of assessment framework at the end of the task lifetime, which is August 2021. So we still have a good year. So these are not yet the qualities of the services themselves, but we discussed between ourselves and our colleagues and stakeholders in other groups, what are the characteristics that this framework should meet? What do we want this framework to look like? And those are listed here. We want it to be comprehensive, applying to a broad range of functionalities, inclusive, many different types of services, really connect to the notion of fair data. So we really want to connect the notion of having a fair digital object to how is the service enabling, respecting, or potentially reducing that. Of course, build upon existing work as much as possible, consider several dimensions, functional and non-functional, and really important, it needs to be actionable, something that service owners can really take to heart and use to further their services. And of course, that also requires support by the community and real-life validation. We just published our first report on Zenodo at the end of February. I put the links here in the chat or on the slide. The slides will be distributed. I can also put the link in the chat maybe afterwards. And feedback to this is very welcome. We wanted to publish this assessment report. It's actually a milestone relatively early on in our process, early on in the game, to make sure that we solicit feedback early on. So all your feedback will be very welcome. Of course, this is very much a team effort. These are the great people who have contributed to the work. I've seen some of you in the call already, so I hope I did justice to the work that we collectively worked on. And of course, what I also really wanted to say, so all feedback is welcome, of course, but specifically if you are a product owner of a data service, we very much look forward to being in touch with you to see if you recognize some of the challenges and the gaps that we have signaled. We want to learn from you what you have done to make your service better, fair, enabling, or fair aligned. But we also really would love to hear what you are still missing. So how can we make this assessment framework really to be of value and actionable for you? So just to recap before I hand it over to Claudia, I think we started with the question, what does it take for a service to be fair? We have corrected that to what does it take for a service to enable fair? The high level answer, a fair assessment framework. That is what we're working on. And we very much welcome your help and your participation and feedback. Thank you very much.
So thank you, okay. And now, Claudia, could continue.
Yes, Hilke has to first stop sharing his screen, and then I think I can, yeah, perfect. So let's see, I should be able to share my screen now. So let's see if I now make this full. You should be able to see my screen. And also, yeah, very welcome from my side. My name is Claudia Behnke. I also work at SURF, the same as Hilke, and I'm the team leader of the data preservation team. So I work, yeah, on preserving data, and I am the task lead of the task 2.3 in FAIRSFAIR, and we are focusing on data repositories. And my title is a bit on purpose challenging because it's called, yeah, FAIRification of data repositories. And I want to start with a small disclaimer because, of course, it's not so straightforward to say, okay, we just make a repository FAIR itself, and then all the objects don't need to care anymore about the digital objects. So what we want to do, and I think what Hilke also nicely explained, in our task, we want to help repositories to implement features which is improving the fairness or the exposure better of the fairness of their data objects. And Hilke already nicely introduced repositories as well as digital objects. So that is something that I can do rather brief. So we use exactly the same definition if we talk about a digital object, which is basically something that's consisting out of a bit stream, and assigned to the bit stream is a persistent identifier, which is pointing or identifying the object, and then metadata is also associated to this bit stream. And I just choose here one metadata model, but you can of course add any other of the world that you like. So just for those that are maybe not so familiar, I just put here 3 different types how you can identify metadata. So you have structural metadata. This is basically data which tells you how the digital object or how the files are ordered. So you can think of, for example, like how a book is, or pages of a book are ordered in chapters. Then we have administrative metadata, which is a metadata type which will tell a user or also a machine what type of data is actually in this digital object, so the type, but also how it can manage this digital object. And last but not least, there's descriptive metadata, which is a data type that we as humans usually would query if we look for a digital object. So for example, the title, it can also be an author, or in many, many cases, it's actually keywords and a subject, because I not necessarily know what is the name of my digital object. And as Hilke also mentioned, there are the FAIR principles, which telling us how we can make these digital objects fair digital objects. And now I don't want to go through the principles, but I want to look at them in the context of a repository. So if we, for example, just look at the FAIR principle 1, that metadata should be assigned, that metadata and data should get a globally unique and persistent identifier. This is, as Hilke mentioned, something that we can, of course, already do while the creation of the data. But I think in reality, in many, many cases, the data, the persistent identifier is added when it is uploaded in a repository. Ideally would be that the persistent identifier is there before, but definitely a repository is something that finally then enables to have a persistent identifier at a digital object. And also, if we look at just having structured metadata, this is also something that ideally it would be there before, but in many cases, actually, while uploading a digital object or a bit stream in a repository, then this special descriptive metadata is added to the file. And these are components that make and ensure basically the fairness through a repository. And as said, there are many, many other parts of the FAIR principles which are directly or indirectly linking to repositories. But what I want to ask myself, or want to ask you, is the question in a sense, how does a data repository basically can expose the fairness of these digital objects? So if we look at our digital object and we put it into a repository, we can again look, okay, which FAIR principles are then really clearly enhanced? And if we think of the FAIR principle F4, that metadata is registered, or data and metadata is registered and indexed in a searchable resource. This is something that's clearly happening at the moment when we put it in a repository, that the digital object is really then findable. Also, the metadata should be, so the A2, the metadata should be accessible even when the data is no longer available. That's also something that is very frequently realized within a repository, because yeah, even if the researcher, while producing the data, is already assigning the metadata, he most likely will not keep the metadata without the data object, but a repository is definitely a service that should do that. So there are, as Silke nicely described, some features which are clearly enhancing the fairness of a repository, some features of a repository which are clearly enhancing the fairness of the digital object. But the question that Silke also raised, are there features which maybe hide the fairness or only keep the fairness of a digital object? And if we look at the digital object from the perspective of a researcher, so someone that is actually wants to find this digital object, well, the fairness is there if the researcher exactly knows that this digital object is existing in the repository. So the researcher can either use the descriptive metadata to query the graphical user interface, or is looking for the file, and then he will be able to find the file. But if we are not sure that this digital object is exactly in this repository, we might need to not only query one repository, but several ones. Then we can get the additional caveat that the metadata in the one repository is maybe different exposed than in the other repository. So one easy example could be that, for example, the repository might look, or the researcher have put German metadata in the repository. So then the researcher would then himself query in German, and if he speaks German, then he may be still able to find a digital object. But well, when we start with many other languages, then at some point the researcher might be lost. So I myself would find a German object, but a Russian object I will not find anymore. And this gets even more complicated if we don't know that a certain object is existing, but if we want to find different digital objects. And if we then want to start querying these digital objects, we basically need to think of the interoperability one, so that the metadata should be exposed in a broadly applicable language. And well, it says a language, but it's not specifying which language, and for good reason, because many different languages that the metadata can be imposed for have advantages and disadvantages. But if I myself, as a researcher, don't know a certain language or don't know a certain metadata model, I might have trouble to find a data set. Or even worse, if I don't understand at all that this metadata is there, it's just lost for me. This is, of course, a very simplified picture, because in reality, a researcher will not query millions of repositories. Hilke already mentioned metadata aggregators, and that's something that researchers often use. So basically, they give their set of maybe metadata or maybe just keywords that they look for in a metadata aggregator. And then this metadata aggregator will query among different repositories and will try to create interoperability between the different different models, how the metadata is exposed. But this is basically only elevating the problem on a different level, because if again the the metadata aggregator does not understand the model, then again this metadata or this repository is not visible to the researcher anymore, or in this case to the metadata aggregator. So as said in the beginning, what we try to do in the task 2.3 is we want to help the repositories to really enable features which is improving the support of fair digital objects. So how can they better expose the fairness of a digital object to a researcher? And we started with this with a workshop last year, and we brought about 70 participants from different communities to Helsinki and let them discuss. And we asked them the following question. Imagine you are a very fair data set. What is your dream repository? So what features does your repository, your dream repository, have that should be enhancing the fairness that you by yourself have? Like Hilke said before, what features do we want for a repository that would enhance the fairness or the exposure of the fairness of my digital object itself? And these requirements were listed in the deliverable that we published. And since you can all read deliverable, I thought I'd give you some extra knowledge in a sense, because we have in the deliverable sorted these requirements in technical and organizational requirements. But what I now want to present you is requirements that we as task 2.3 try to solve, and some that we just cannot solve. So I will not mention all the requirements that were mentioned, but I just will highlight some and explicitly mention those that we solve. And additionally to the requirements, I add in a sense which part of FAIR this requirement should enhance. So if we, for example, look, one requirement that was mentioned at the workshop was the repository itself should have a persistent identifier. That's something that, well, we as task 2.3 cannot force on a repository, but that every repository hopefully can do by itself. And this would definitely increase the findability and also the accessibility of the data set, because it is increasing both the findability of the repository and also the accessibility of a repository. Another a requirement that was mentioned in the workshop was explicit data deletion policy, so that it's explicitly clear if data is deleted, what of the data should remain. And that is also something that, that is absolutely important to keep the fairness of the digital object, so that, for example, the metadata is still available after the data is deleted. But this is also something that the repositories basically have to do themselves, and we cannot help them in that. Another very nice feature was also the technical support for predefined file formats. And in this case, it's really enhancing the interoperability if a researcher gets a support for a community standard file format and knows, okay, how do I upload this file format in the repository? How can I reuse this file format to really ensure that the file format, so that the interoperability between the different data sets is enhanced. Then there were quite some requirements on persistent identifiers, and one nice one that I liked, there were two, that it should be, a persistent identifier should be definitely assigned to each object or each part of the digital object, but also only one should be assigned, so that not that we have 5 different types of identifiers registered for the same object, but to really make sure that you can identify the object with one persistent identifier. Some sets of requirements focused on the interaction of the user with the repository, and there were some which were, well, wanted to help the user in the sense that the repository should provide masks which help the user to upload metadata. But on the other hand, clear requirements were also that the repository should also demand from the user that they really have to use add metadata. And the last one, which I want to mention here, which would include the interoperability and reusability of a data set, is the connection between data repositories and compute infrastructures. The idea was that if you can avoid that an object needs to be first downloaded and then uploaded again in a compute infrastructure, that then this data set not necessarily need to be modified. So this is also something that was mentioned as a requirement. As I said, there are many, many more, and unfortunately, task 2.3 cannot solve them, or not all of them. So we want to focus on one very special problem. Here again, you have the digital object like you saw before, and what task 2.3 wants to do, we want to build a prototype. And this prototype will be based on the FAIR data point, and we try to incorporate then the DCAT version 2, so the data catalog vocabulary from the W3 recommendations. And in a very easy, understandable way, what we want to do is we want to bring the metadata closer to the data. So we want to make it easier for a repository to expose the metadata in a fair manner, so to really expose the fairness. And that brings me to requirements which were given in the workshop, which we are going to solve. And the first requirement was that the repository should provide a search interface or be linked to an aggregating service that enables the findability. And this is exactly what our prototype and already the existing FAIR data point is doing. So it is giving a chance to really increase the findability of data objects through an API. Another requirement, which is increasing the interoperability of a data set or of a digital object, is that the data model would be exposed in a machine readable form. That is also something that the prototype and also the core FAIR data point is already doing. a requirement on the documentation and of the interfaces and the APIs, we also are going to, well, definitely increase in the sense that the repository would not need to learn 5 different APIs anymore, or researchers would not need to learn 5 different APIs, but the repositories would only need to provide one API, which is then connected to the prototype. And then they don't need to have different other prototypes, different other APIs, which can be connected to other services. Wrong direction, sorry. Another requirement which we are definitely going to solve was the quick question that the repository should have itself also machine readable metadata, so that there's metadata available about the repository itself, and that this should be also machine readable. And this is actually the first layer of the FAIR data point, or of the metadata that is exposed in the FAIR data point. So this is something that we definitely can solve in our task. Then there was the requirement to reuse and implement community standards and ontologies from public registries. And this is something that our prototype is, in a sense, trying to tackle together with task 2.2. So there is, as Jessica mentioned, a task in this work package which is working on ontologies, and we are very strongly collaborating to make it possible that also the ontologies itself can be exposed in a fair way. And with this exposure, we can enhance the metadata, or make the metadata that is enhanced, that is gathered by the prototype, also more fair. And a last requirement that we can solve was that the metadata should be exposed as an RDF, and this is definitely something that the prototype also will solve. We have some requirements which we will partially solve, and with partially I mean that we as task 2.3 can partially only solve them, because we need also the help of other tasks or a combination with the cooperation with the repositories. So one requirement was that the repository need to be listed in the registries of repositories. And well, yeah, 1/3 we can in a sense solve, which is basically providing a prototype which will help the repositories to expose their metadata to these registries. Another part, another third is, so to say, done by work package 4, which is registering and labeling then repositories. And of course, yeah, another part needs to be done by the repositories itself, because we cannot, would need to really try to use the prototype and also to actively try to go through the certifications. Something that we can also only partially solve was that the request was that repository should provide metadata in different formats. And as said before, well, we choose that this prototype would expose metadata in one special format and not in all various different formats. The next requirement was that the persistent identifier should be also interferable by machines, or the metadata should be interferable by via the persistent identifier. And this is something that we only can partially solve in the sense, because we will not force a repository which persistent identifier they have to use. But if they use certain types of persistent identifiers, for example, handles, then it's definitely possible via the persistent identifier access to, or via the persistent identifier, understand the metadata better, so to say. And the last requirement is a machine readable license, which will clearly increase the reusability of the data set, because it doesn't help if my data set, if I can technically understand my data set, but I'm not sure if I can reuse it. And if the machine, so in this case, the prototype already knows that this data set is reusable, then this would definitely be enhanced. However, again, we only can support a certain type of already machine readable licenses. But if the license is itself not machine readable, then we either need to model an RDF or try to map the user then to a human readable and understandable page. But this is also stuff that is like ongoing. So let's see how far we in the sense can go. And yeah, this basically brings me to the end. I also want to thank the team. I could not find pictures of everyone, so this is only a part of the team that is working on that. And as Jessica and Hilke also mentioned, there is the option that you say, okay, I absolutely don't agree with what Claudia says, or I have a much better idea. It doesn't matter what is the case. We are very happy about input for a community review on the deliverable. And yeah, there is also a plan how we go further. So what we will do, we have 6 developer repositories and 6 tester repositories, and we will, with these repositories, run a workshop, a digital workshop on May the 6th, and see how we can really connect them to our first ideas of a prototype, and also see if this is something that's feasible for them. So with that, I yeah, thank you for the attention, and I give the slides, the mic back to Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, we have many questions.
Oh dear.
I will trying to answer some of those which I can answer quickly. We had some discussions here in the comments about the seeing the questions, and I hope you can see the answers too. But maybe I could give you some of these questions that are most directly to you. Maybe this first one was to Hilke. How did you select the case studies? Did you find any relevant examples? Would you like to?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. We started with the EOSC catalog because we wanted the services that we were going to use for the case studies to already be part of the EOSC. It was a bit of ad hoc, but we wanted to choose 3 that were quite different in terms of their functionality and also the audience and level of maturity, so that collectively they sort of are a good representative of the different types of services that are included there. So basically those 2 criteria: 1, included in the EOSC catalog or the EOSC portal, and 2, 3 rather distinct ones, so that we don't do the same exercise 3 times. And again, maybe I should point out that it was definitely not our intention to already make statements that carry a lot of weight around the FAIR enablement or the FAIR assessment of these particular services. It was really meant to basically road test our methodology and solicit feedback on the methodology.
Thank you. Then maybe just one more, if you could want to clarify about FAIR. There's a question from Hannes. It's clear. Is the task about whether a service is fair in itself or whether a service supports a fairness of data? So maybe you would like to.
Yeah, so that's the question I started with, right? So Hannes, thank you for asking it. If that's I may have not done a great job explaining that. So let me. It's good that you ask it, so I get another shot. We felt it would be most useful to let the task specifically be around how can services support, enable FAIR. What we probably will arrive at that some of these FAIR principles also apply to the service itself, like it makes sense for a service to be findable. However, that should not be the purpose in and of itself. We start with sort of our primary question is how does a service fit into the FAIR data ecosystem, i.e. how does it make digital objects more fair? And then we expect to find that some of these FAIR principles will also reflect on the service, but that's secondary.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer the question?
Okay. Hopefully, maybe we could take the following question also. It might from Anu. How does task 2.4 relate to 2.3? Maybe Claudia would like to answer that, to elaborate a bit more on this.
So yeah, the tasks in the sense relate to each other, that they're of course in the same work package. So we know what the other task is, so to say, doing. And I think you also saw that we very much use the same vocabulary and also try to align on the way how we speak about objects. Since the task 2.3 is really going to be a very technical task and is trying to implement a prototype, basically we leave the assessment of repositories to work package 4, and we so the certification in a sense to work package 4, and we will really focus on this prototype and try to make it make it happen, so to say, that at least our developer and tester repositories, and hopefully in the future much more repositories, can in a simple way connect to this prototype and then expose their data in a fair way. I don't know, Hilke, if you want to comment.
Yeah, just to summarize. So yes, I agree with all you said. And in addition to that, just to summarize it, I think the difference is twofold. Scope 2.4 is around data services in general, which is not only data repositories. It's more broad in that sense. And the type of output, I think, as Claudia mentioned in her talk, 2.3 is quite a technical task, and it will deliver a working prototype, right? 2.4 is less technical in that sense. We will develop an assessment framework, which at the end, which is something else than functioning code.
Okay, thank you. Then there has been quite a lot of discussion about PIDs and at what stage PIDs should be assigned in the chat. And yeah, Sarah Jones here is wondering about if there is a particular category of identifiers we suggest for repositories for PIDs for repositories, and how do we think about catalogs like RE3 data or the IOSC portal? Do we know? I don't know about this. I know that there are several different efforts to try to give identifiers, but I don't think it is organized well enough, or maybe yet coordinated. I don't know.
So that's definitely something that we as 2.3 are not focusing on. As said, there are possibilities of also, well, exposing, combining in a sense the exposure of the metadata via the persistent identifier in the sense, but that is, as said, not possible just for all persistent identifier. There are some persistent identifier where this can be done, but it's not a standard thing. And we don't want to basically tell a repository how they have to organize their data, because usually repositories know why they choose a certain type of persistent identifier. And as said, there is, especially in this case of exposure, also the possibility of creating some workarounds. So maybe that's, yeah, but I'm really no expert on persistent identifiers.
Yeah, I think RE3 data science DOIs for the, but then is that only for the metadata and for the service itself? There's always this discussion, I think, that we have to have, and there's also a certain difference between, say, library perception of how metadata and persistent identifiers relate to each other, and how it's considered in the FAIR data context. So then there's a comment from Francois. It would be useful to also define the subset of FAIR principles that applies to services themselves, not only as a second priority. This could provide useful guidelines to the services.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I think I may have not expressed myself very well. So I don't think it's a second priority, but it's sort of secondary in the sense that it follows from trying to identify how a service can be a valuable and useful part of the FAIR data ecosystem. And I think as a consequence of that, you would want a service to also be findable and accessible. So some of these criteria will map, I think, almost one-on-one. Others might need a little bit of translation or refining the scope of the statement. So yes, I absolutely expect we'll find that, and that's part of the work still to come.
Okay, then there's one question from Emmanuel. How do you deal with the distinction between domain-specific repositories and generic repositories? Are there tests specific for domain-specific repositories? Maybe Claudia would.
Yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, in our developer repositories, we have only domain-specific repositories, which makes it just much more straightforward to especially align the work with task 2.2, because if we have domain-specific repositories, we don't have a million different ontologies in a sense that need to be exposed in a fair manner and then connected. So we are really currently also focusing more on the domain specific ones, just because it's a more straightforward way to go. But I would find it also interesting to really open to more general repositories, because then it gets extra challenging with standardization of metadata schemas, for example.
Yes, these are sort of the first steps. Then Yuri wonders, for the repositories chosen as test repositories, what will be the next step?
I mentioned already that there will be the workshop, and we of course were also a bit hit by Corona, so we had actually a workshop planned in April where we wanted to meet as task 2.3 with the developer and the tester repositories, and we have also sent out invitations to them, but now we are due to Corona need to postpone or modify it a bit. So to the developer and the tester repositories, we have sent out an invitation. We're going to do this workshop digital at the 6th of May. And if there's, if for some reason the repository from Yuri was missing in a sense, because I thought that the tester repositories should have gotten the mail, then please write me an email that we make sure that you are on board.
Yes, of course. We try to be open and inclusive in all ways. So we hope if somebody is interested to join the email list, who's not getting email from us in repository, we have an email list for repositories who are interested in this, how we are proceeding. So please let us know. Okay, I see we're running out of time now. There are so many questions here and a lot of good discussions.
Good.
This is fantastic. And I hope that we can, Rita, keep this, not close the meeting until we are sure we have picked up on this. And maybe we could try to write a blog post or something to, and continue this, maybe answer some of the questions if there are some common themes that we would like to comment on. There are questions about the metadata standard, for instance, for the repository itself, and it's there's also an answer that it's the V3 data org schema. So it will be on a quite generic level at this point in time. So thank you really a lot for taking time to participating and listening and being so active. This has been fantastic. I hope we can continue this discussion in many workshops and many fora, and please be in touch and continue giving feedback and comments through all channels. So hope to see you again soon. So thank you and goodbye.
Thanks all.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.